So the description of this evening's panel in the brochure starts by stating, countering the hypocrisy and the unrealistic vision of the Paris World Climate Summit. Now, this is a very important issue. It is important because the intention of the climate summit is to impose a global control over the ability of nations to emit carbon dioxide. Carbon means energy. It means clean water. It means transportation. It means electricity. It means refrigeration, and so on. This is a life or death issue for billions of people on this planet. So this is a very important issue. And from our next two speakers, we're going to be given a very clear presentation on how the arguments for a man-made climate crisis are false. But here, I will start by emphasizing the ideological motivation behind this ridiculous claim for a man-made climate crisis. Because this is not only about climate, this is about an ideological view of the nature of the human species. What is mankind? And what is mankind's purpose? These are the questions at play here, and these are the questions I would like to discuss. So let's start from the top. We should have the, okay, great. So I want to look at the claims of a man-made climate crisis from the specific standpoint of the oligarchical view of mankind of the British Empire. This is the belief that the majority of mankind is a cancer on the planet. The belief that mankind is just an animal species which has overrun its limits and must be reined in with a massive population reduction program. Now, I'm not exaggerating in stating this. This is the ideology and the policy of practice of the British royal family and the British imperial establishment. To highlight just one example, the current royal consort to the Queen of England, Queen Elizabeth II, Prince Philip, has spoken quite openly of these views. In December 1981, for example, in an interview with People magazine, he was asked, "What do you consider to be the leading threat to the environment?" And Prince Philip responded, quote, it's displayed here on the screen, "Human population growth is probably the single most serious long-term threat to survival. We're in a major disaster if it isn't curbed, not just for the natural world, but for the human world. The more people there are, the more resources they'll consume, the more pollution they'll create, the more fighting they'll do. We have no option. If it isn't controlled voluntarily, it will be controlled involuntarily by an increase in disease, starvation, and warfare." The interviewer then asked for an example, and Philip responded, "Well, I was in Sri Lanka recently, where a United Nations project set out in the late 1940s to eradicate malaria. It's an island, and it was therefore possible to destroy the mosquito carrying the disease. What people didn't realize was that malaria was actually controlling the growth of the population. The consequence was that within 20 years, the population doubled. Now we've got to find something for all those people to do and some way to feed them." So rather than being happy about the countless people that were spared the horrific effects of suffering and death by malaria, Philip lamented the eradication of the disease because it allowed for population growth. And we have another quite infamous quote from Prince Philip in a foreword to a 1986 book entitled "If I Were an Animal." Prince Philip wrote, quote, "I just wonder what it would be like to be reincarnated in an animal whose species had been so reduced in numbers that it was in danger of extinction. What would its feelings towards the human species? What would be its feelings towards the human species, whose population expansion had denied it somewhere to exist? I must confess that I am tempted to ask for reincarnation as a particularly deadly virus." And he repeated this same sentiment in August 1988 in a discussion with the German press, again saying, quote, "In the event I am reincarnated, I would like to return as a deadly virus in order to contribute something to overpopulation." And Prince Philip is not merely some inbred monarch making crazy statements. He has been quite influential and active in working with people who share a similar view. They have stated explicitly that their policy is to reduce the world population to only a few billion people. Philip was instrumental in the creation of the modern so-called environmentalist movement in the 1960s. He did so in close collaboration with a former Nazi SS member, the late Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands, and with a leading eugenicist, Julian Huxley, a man who was still promoting eugenics after World War II and was president of the British Eugenics Society from 59 to 62. They created the World Wildlife Fund, and they worked together with together in financing the movement in collaboration with leading Anglo-Dutch cartels and banking institutions. They picked up and promoted the claims of a man-made climate change crisis. And they have argued that massive depopulation is the only way to address the issue. Most recently through organizations like the Optimum Population Trust. Now, this is obviously only a very brief sketch. A lot more can be said on this issue, and I will reference people to the material put out by Lyndon LaRouche's Executive Intelligence Review, including a report from the 1990s entitled "The Coming Fall of the House of Windsor." But I just wanted to give a small taste of the ideology behind the promotion of this climate change scare. And another indication of this, I should also briefly note that Queen Elizabeth II herself came out very strongly in 2009 in an attempt to rally support for the 2009 climate summit in Copenhagen. She used the occasion of the meeting of the entire British Commonwealth heads of state to call for the Commonwealth to exert its global power and support the climate change summit. And at the time, this action was denounced by people like Lord Christopher Monckton from within the British system itself, because this was a blatant violation of the supposed ban on the monarch intervening in these types of day-to-day political affairs. Normally, the Queen acts from behind the scenes, but in this case, she felt it quite necessary to come out very publicly and push this climate issue. So we have this oligarchical view of mankind as a plague on the planet, and the supporters of that view are promoting and using the climate change scare. The point is, we cannot separate science from ideology. These people have an ideological view and agenda first, and they cherry-pick the supposed science second. So this winter's Paris Climate Summit is an important battle in the context of this larger conflict over our understanding of the nature of mankind. Is mankind just a beast overstretching its boundaries? Just another animal species to be herded and culled as Prince Philip has openly called for? Or is mankind something different? So to address this all-important question, this central issue we're dealing with right now, let's take a few minutes to examine the characteristics of the human species. And I'm going to use the example of freshwater resources as a case study. This will have some overlap with the issue of climate, but I'm going to focus on the issue of water resources. Now, any animal species is bounded by certain ecological characteristics. If we look at the work of Vladimir Vernadsky, for example, we can even use these ecological characteristics to define a species as a distinct species. This includes a fixed carrying capacity or maximum population level for that species, partly determined by the limited amounts of resources available to that species, along with other factors. And the animal species cannot act to change its own ecological characteristics. But is this the same for mankind? That's the central question. It is being said that many regions around the world are running out of fresh water resources, affecting billions of people. In the United States, where I'm from, this is most clear in the state of California. Here are some recent news headlines covering the California drought. The New York Times wrote, "California drought tests history of endless growth. A punishing drought is forcing a reconsideration of whether the aspiration of untrammeled growth that has for so long been the state's engine has run against the limits of nature." The Sacramento Bee wrote, "State's population growth expected to outstrip water conservation in coming years." And another headline from KPCC Radio, "Population growth could stymie California water conservation efforts." So some people, including the current governor of California, are saying that California has reached the limits to growth, that the population has grown beyond the carrying capacity. Is this true? Now, obviously, there are many factors involved in defining something like carrying capacity, maximum population level. But here, people are clearly drawing the line on the issue of water, so let's address that. Now, most water resources used globally today are based on one category of interaction with the water cycle, basically managing the water that has fallen or precipitated onto land. Now, this does define a finite supply. That's a finite amount of water, and that has certain limitations. But we already know today that mankind is not bound to those limits. We can develop other aspects of the water cycle. With desalination, for example, we can produce fresh water directly from the oceans. But what is this? This is an expansion of the prior boundary, taking something that was not considered or even able to be considered a natural resource in a previous stage and making it into a resource. What changed? The natural conditions of the environment didn't change. Nature didn't change. It was mankind that changed his potential characteristics of behavior, resulting in a self-generated transformation of his own ecological characteristics as a species. No animal species can do this. But let's take a more advanced, I think a more interesting example. Again, addressing this water issue as a case study. We can also increase and even direct rainfall by controlling certain aspects of the weather. Now, in this case, I'm not referring to the more popularly known forms of cloud seeding. but ground-based ionization systems can accelerate the condensation and precipitation of atmospheric water vapor. Now, normally only 10% of the water evaporated from the oceans precipitates over land. The rest falls back into the oceans. And the fraction that does make it over land is distributed very unevenly in location and in time. But with these types of ground-based ionization systems, which I'll detail towards the end of my talk, we can actually begin to change that, influencing atmospheric moisture flows, increasing rainfall, and expanding the freshwater resources available to mankind. Again, if we reflect on this, reflect back on what this means, this is something unique about the human species. This shows us again that mankind can act to redefine what is considered a natural resource and create new ecological characteristics and boundaries for our own species. By this activity, mankind demonstrates a capability absent from the animal species. Again, the behavioral characteristics of any single animal species is fixed. They don't change their fundamental relation to the environment. Mankind can change his behavior, and mankind does so by acting on discoveries of what we could call universal physical principles, allowing mankind to act on processes which are outside the domain of animal-like experience, outside the domain of sense perception or sensual experience. And by doing so, by doing this, it enables mankind to act as if he recreates himself as a new, higher-order species, if we look at his new ecological characteristics. So now with this insight, we can get into some interesting questions. For this case study, for the issue of water, how is this expressed? How exactly are we looking at providing the water resources needed by utilizing weather control systems? What is the higher principle we could be acting on that will allow us to redefine our ecological characteristics? The answer is, in this case, by understanding the higher order system of our galaxy, which subsumes our solar system, which subsumes our Earth and the processes therein. Now, to understand this, I'm going to go through a few examples. We have records of long-term changes in the activity of the water cycle and changes in the activity of the climate more generally, which are very closely associated with changes in the amount of galactic influence our planet experiences. For example, in this case illustrated here, in this study, we see that changes in climate, in this case, as measured in changes in the amount of glaciation and ice flow in the northern Atlantic Ocean, correspond very, very closely to changes in the amount of galactic cosmic radiation reaching the Earth. And in this study, we see that a very tight relationship is demonstrated over the past 12,000 years. This next study demonstrates another very close correspondence between, in this case, changes in rainfall measured in proxy records on the Arabian Peninsula in modern-day Oman, corresponding, again, very closely with changes in the amount of galactic cosmic radiation which have been measured to reach the Earth, in this case, roughly between 9,000 and 6,000 years ago. So in these cases, I've highlighted a couple out of a number of studies that indicate various aspects of this. But in these cases, we are seeing changes in climate and weather, natural changes in climate and weather, associated with changes which we would attribute to what we could call a galactic influence. Now, on these timescales, these two studies that I just highlighted, We're witnessing the effects of variations. We are probably witnessing the effects of variations in the activity of the sun, our star. Since the sun's magnetic field, the strength of the activity of our sun, can act to regulate the amount of galactic cosmic radiation reaching the Earth. But on much longer timescales, we actually see an even different process. We see larger climate changes, which are actually associated with the solar system traveling into different galactic environments, traveling into different parts of our galactic system. And we measure this over the case of millions, tens of millions, and hundreds of millions of years. So very, very long timescales. In this example of one of these studies, the American-Israeli researcher Nir Shaviv showed that the passage of our solar system through the spiral arms of our galactic system corresponds very well with periods of major global glaciation and dramatic cooling on Earth. In another study by Shaviv, he shows that temperature variations, records of very long-term temperature variations, also correspond with our understanding of the periodic motion of our solar system kind of bobbing above and below the disk, the planar disk of our galactic system. Now, Shaviv and others, including the Danish researcher Heinrich Svensmark, who's pioneered some of this work, have hypothesized that this galactic climate relationship is due to variations in what's called atmospheric ionization, which are produced by the very high energy galactic cosmic radiation intersecting the Earth's atmosphere. And they have hypothesized and investigated how this ionization, the level, the strength of the ionization process, plays an important role in affecting how water behaves in the atmosphere, and including affecting cloud formation and therefore climate. Now, this is a remarkable revelation. It tells us that the Earth's atmosphere, the atmosphere we live in, the atmosphere we breathe, the atmosphere we've evolved in, is in part actually a galactic atmosphere. And the Earth's climate, the climate we live in, the climate we depend upon, it expresses variations in the climate of our galaxy. So as our solar system has traveled through various regions of the galaxy, we see that processes on Earth respond to this changing galactic environment. And this provides a very important insight on the issue of water and water resources. But before I conclude with that point, I want to briefly stretch our imagination with a few other provocative studies indicating how this galactic process might influence other processes on Earth more generally. Here we see a reference to another study. In 2005, it was shown that the total number of different living species on Earth, as recorded in the fossil records over the past 500 million years, went through certain cyclical variations. So this is the evolutionary record of advanced life on Earth. They found cycles in the biodiversity pattern, regular periods of rise and fall in the number of species. Now, although only very briefly mentioned in this initial study, these biodiversity cycles correspond very well with these same periods of our solar system's motion through our galaxy's spiral arms and the motion above and below our galaxy's plane. A more recent study has pointed to what might be a periodicity in mass extinctions and examined how this mass extinction periodicity might correspond with the passage of our solar system through our galaxy's central disk. And a 2012 study by Heinrich Svensmark showed that records of variations in the overall productivity of the biosphere, measures of how active and how vibrant, how productive the whole biosphere was over the evolutionary time, very long time scales, actually correspond rather well with new models and estimates of the varying supernova environment of our solar system. Again, as our solar systems experienced different environments of the galactic system. So we see provocative indications that perhaps evolutionary development, the development of life on Earth, might actually express some relationship to our galactic system. And this is perhaps also maybe even expressed in the activity of the Earth itself, geophysical activity, looking at things like volcanism and sedimentation rates. Now, this area is a little more challenging to understand how this might be the case, but we do see clues pointing in this direction. Here in this study, it was shown that the 60 million year, one of the cycles in biodiversity, which I just showed on the previous slide, also corresponds very, very well with cycles in certain geophysical processes, including things like sedimentation. Now, although the authors of this particular study don't mention it, these also correspond very well with the motion of our solar system above and below the galactic plane. Another study has shown that periods of major volcanic eruptions might correspond with the motion of our solar system through the midplane of our galaxy. And for fun, I also personally compared the periods of large-scale volcanism on Earth with the most recent periods of volcanic activity on the Moon, on another planetary body, based on a recent study showing that the Moon has actually been volcanically active more recently than we had thought. And from the data I could find, as is indicated here, the three most recent major volcanic events on Earth and on the Moon actually correspond quite well, indicating that perhaps these bodies are independently responding to some external influence. Now, these examples in geophysics would certainly challenge our current concepts of how the Earth functions and how the Earth relates to these galactic environments. Now, these studies that I just ran through rather quickly provide us with questions, not answers. For a better understanding of the evolution of life on Earth, for a better understanding of how the climate naturally changes, and perhaps maybe even certain insights into how our own Earth operates, we are being pointed to understanding our relationship to our galactic system. Now, there are existing hypotheses in many of these papers which try and explain these correlations we're looking at here. And for the sake of time, obviously I can't go through every aspect of this. But I am also of the view that some of these correlations could very well be clues directing us to new areas of science which we haven't yet discovered. We already know that there are processes in galaxies which we have not yet been able to understand with our current level of science. For example, we have anomalies in how gravitation is measured, provoking investigations into what's often referred to as hypothetical types of dark matter. Or we have the activity of supermassive objects in the centers of galaxies, so-called supermassive black holes, where our current mathematical physics literally breaks down. And in some of these galaxies, and in some of these supermassive objects in the centers of these galaxies, Some of them are incredibly active. They're not just sucking things in, they're emitting massive amounts of energy and matter. In some cases, this tiny region in the center of these galaxies is actually outshining and more energetic than the billions of stars of the entire host galaxy. We also see incredibly large-scale dynamic and coherent structures, which are quite difficult to explain with our current level of understanding. So the point of all of this is that when we go to this level of the galaxy, in our case, the Milky Way, our home galaxy, but when we go to this level of galactic systems, there is much we don't yet understand. There's much we don't understand about how these processes operate on this galactic scale, and in how processes on Earth are affected by our own higher order galactic system. And I believe this will certainly be a major scientific frontier in the coming generations. The pursuit of a galactic principle, as Kepler had discovered the principle of our solar system centuries earlier. So now that we've kind of stretched our imaginations a little bit and pondered some rather provocative indications, let's come back to conclude on the issue of climate and water. How can we today use these insights into this much larger galactic process? Well, as we went through, we see indications that the Earth's climate, including the behavior of water and the water cycle, is partially, at least, a product of this galactic environment, of our galactic atmosphere. And to the best of our current understanding, this is related, again, to the role of very high-energy galactic cosmic radiation in controlling certain ionization properties of the Earth's atmosphere. And while we have discussed here the effects of very long-term variations, tens of millions of years, hundreds of millions of years, we also see this expressed on much, much shorter timescales, even over the course of days. In this study indicated here, we have very sudden drops in the flux of galactic cosmic radiation reaching the Earth's atmosphere, a process referred to as four-bush decreases. And when you have this sharp reduction in the ionizing effects of galactic cosmic radiation, we measure very clearly corresponding changes in the behavior of the atmosphere, in the behavior of atmospheric water vapor and related processes. So in this study, what's being shown here is a very sharp decrease in the ionizing effects of galactic cosmic rays. And within days, not millions of years, within days, we see a decrease in the amount of water measured in clouds. We see a decrease in the density of aerosols found in the atmosphere, and a decrease in the amount of low-level cloud cover. We see all these as a response to this short-term variation in the change of the atmosphere's galactic environment. So now, what does all this mean for water and water resources? We have good evidence to indicate that we can use this insight to manage these conditions ourselves. Ground-based ionization systems to control the ionization qualities of a local region of the atmosphere have been successfully used to control and increase rainfall and even direct flows of atmospheric moisture. This has been done for years in Mexico, in Israel. It's been tested in Russia, in Oman, in Australia, and other locations. By controlling the ionization conditions of the atmosphere, these systems have been successful in accelerating the condensation of water vapor and increasing precipitation. And I want to highlight just one example. There is an ongoing trial program of this technology in Oman right now, being conducted by the company Australian Rain Technologies. And they have successfully used this technology to increase rainfall for the first 2 years of their ongoing 5-year trial. Now, I thought it was a very, very interesting comparison to compare this with desalination, because the estimated amount of rainfall increase in Oman annually is comparable to the amount of water which would be provided by the largest desalination plant in the Western Hemisphere, currently being built in California. However, the desalination plant takes 20,000 times more energy, more power to operate. So here we see we can get a similar amount of water on the order of 20,000 times more efficient by tapping into these atmospheric processes. And as you can see in the slide here, this is an overview of other places where this technology has been developed. And we've put out a lot more material on these individual case studies, the results, etc. But in conclusion, I should say I took this water issue as just one brief case study for how mankind changes his behavior to cohere with higher order processes and thereby change the available resources available to our species and change the level of population we can sustain. So in this case study with water, we see that with going to a galactic perspective, understanding the role of our galactic system in shaping processes on Earth, we can use that insight to help solve the water needs in California and other locations. And this should tell us something very important. For mankind, there are no inherent limits to growth. What makes mankind distinct from the other animal species is exactly this type of process of mankind acting to change his own ecological characteristics. This is a unique type of action which defines mankind. This type of action in changing the ecological boundaries and limits is an expression of the difference of man from animal. And this is how mankind creates the future. For mankind, the future is not just the unfolding of clock time. For mankind, it is this type of change associated with the generation of a new, higher order relationship with the universe. So the point is, every individual in the human species has the inherent right to have the opportunity to participate in that process. To deny that, to deny this type of creative development of the human species is evil. The zero growth ideology of the British Empire of Prince Philip is evil. It is anti-human. It is denying humanity what makes humanity distinct. So I think this is the deeper issue underlying the upcoming Paris Climate Summit. And we must reject the fraud of a man-made climate crisis and instead adopt things like a galactic science driver to deal with the water needs of the planet by elevating mankind to a galactic level as part of a commitment to international collaboration in endless progress, endless development, and endless growth. Thank you.